the right environment, because we're going to talk a lot about how the autistic experience is all about the environment. There we go. I like to start with a content warning, because discussions about the autistic experience always always end up including discussing traumatic experiences, self-harm, mental health issues, isolation, and suicidal ideation and attempted suicide. And if that is something that you need to be careful with for yourself, please do leave. We want you to feel comfortable so that you can get the best from this. So today we're going to discuss your current knowledge, and there's going to be a part where I'm going to ask you to put stuff in the chat box about what you already know about what it means to be autistic. And so my thing is going all on its own. I'm going to go back to that slide. Okay. We're going to talk about autistic processing and how that's different from neurotypical processing. I'm going to do a very generic version. Oh. Stop presentation. Give me a second. It is not playing the game. Stay. The current research and understanding what ableism looks like in public spaces and how we can actually change things to make support autism affirming as opposed to kind of what it is now. So this is where we get to the part where I'm going to ask you, what do you already know? And I'm going to exit actually from the presentation for a second and stop sharing, because I can't see the chat box while that's on. So this part is very much for you to say in the chat box, what do you already know? What have you heard? What do you think it means to be autistic? So throw your answers into the chat box and we'll talk about it. Sensory, yes. Sensory issues, yes. And sensory is a complicated thing, right? So it's not just bright lights and stuff. Masking and burnout are part of the autistic experience. Yes, thank you, Allison. And we're going to talk more about that. Nikki says the world we know takes little account of autistic needs and preferences. That is true. Sensory overload, difficulty connecting to others. We can talk a little bit about that. Lots of stress caused by the expectation from school, family, community, emotional outbursts. So we'll talk about that. Yep. Day-to-day tasks can be overwhelming. Yes. Yeah. Children can find it impossible to attend school. Absolutely. And yes, Ronnie, it's a very individual experience. There are any number of elements of the environment, as Dara has said, there are any number of elements: sensory, noise, touch, smell, just the number of people in a class. Routines are important, and knowing what to expect in a variety of situations. And we are going to talk about that, because routines are important, but it's not just any old routine. And that can end up being a demand that ends up going the wrong way. Yes, yes. Okay, so negative impact on mental health and well-being. So it seems like you've all got a fairly good, yes, Allison, good point. Sensory things can also be calming. And so that it is important to look at the full picture of what an autistic person's experience is in order to best understand how to support them. It isn't just what distresses them that matters. Okay, so everybody here sounds fairly up on things. So well done, you. now I have to hit the share button again, don't I? I was going to use 2 computers to do this. That's what I should have done. Okay. Open up. Okay. So here are the things that I kind of pre-gathered about what the autistic experience means. And the important element of these is that it's about how information is processed in and out. That takes longer. My slides are just not working today. They were working. I just want Hannah to confirm that they were working before we started.
Yep.
They were, Carrie. I wonder if it would work rather than showing it as a slideshow, just to show it slide by slide.
Okay. Well, they're doing it now.
And they look amazing.
Thank you. I worked really hard on making nice colors. So the autistic experience is about information. It's about how we're coping, and that coping is not the same thing as enjoying life. A lot of the things that we consider to be examples of distress are a young person showing us that they need more time for something, or they need an extra space for something. The slides are gone. Okay. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're still there.
Okay, because that disappeared, so I didn't know if I was talking to nothing.
No, you were still there.
Okay. I didn't hit stop sharing. So, do you know what? I just want everybody to know I picked up my computer at the computer repair place at 9:55 this morning. And obviously that was too soon. Okay. So, the most important thing overall, behavior is communication.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as Ronnie said, it's an individual experience, but it's important that we understand what that looks like. That autism is a spectrum, but not a line that goes from little to no autism to really, really lots of autism. That is not what the spectrum is. The spectrum is like a color wheel, or I like to discuss it as a soundboard, like a mixing board for music. There are different levels, there are different dials, and depending on the day, that can be a different experience than the day before. So just because I was able to do something yesterday doesn't mean I'm going to be able to do it today or tomorrow. And that could be very frustrating, I know, for adults around autistic young people, because they think the young person is just being challenging or difficult, when in reality, just because they did it yesterday doesn't mean they're going to be able to do it today. There are a lot of NeuroWild slides in this presentation because I love her. And if you don't follow NeuroWild on Facebook, you absolutely 100% should, because she's amazing. She's a speech pathologist who's also multiply neurodivergent. And her artwork really captures the essence of the things that we try to talk about, to try to explain about what it's like to be us on the inside. So this picture here of this little mouse is showing that, you know, some of us are able to keep swimming some of the time, and other times, all of those things that we've already talked about, right? The emotional dysregulation, the exhaustion, the trauma, the masking, those things will just be dragging us down, and we're fighting against them. And so you may not see those things, but it doesn't mean that an autistic person isn't dealing with them. To understand the autistic processing, the way the brain processes things, we need to really consider first what a typical brain does. So a typical brain has this function where if it hasn't used a piece of information in a while, it kills off that branch and lets it die and it disappears. It's called pairing. So it gets paired off, and then there's only as many connections in the brain as are needed for the information that's most often used. An autistic brain does not do that. An autistic brain keeps those branches most of the time. Some might get paired off, some might get a little bit paired off, but generally speaking, we have a lot more connectivity going on in our brains. That's why processing of information takes longer to come in and to go out. So we need to we are taking in everything that is around us, things that you're probably not noticing as a neurotypical person, because your brain knows how to filter that out. But for us, we're getting all of it all of the time. So we have a lot more information coming in that takes longer time to process. It takes us a longer time to formulate a response to that because we're trying to work our way through all of it. And then it'll take us a little bit longer to process it out. It doesn't mean that we're not understanding. It means that we're processing. And so autistic people need that extra space. Hannah, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna add just like a bit of nuance to that as well, is that for me anyway, is that when I'm being given information or asked to make a decision or yeah, I've been, dropped a bomb, whatever, I might react like in the moment. I'll say whatever I think that I need to say to get through that moment in masking or whatever. But it doesn't mean that what I've said has been the result of what I've processed, if you know what I mean. I could come back and a week later and give you a totally different reaction because I've had the time. It's not always just somebody kind of freezing and going silent and not able to offer a response because they need time. Sometimes there's masking and things involved. So yeah, there's that to consider as well. When you're giving information, I know that I will give an answer straight away, but I also need time to go and think about it because it'll likely change.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. And also that it's usually not very helpful to expect an autistic person to respond on the spot because there's just too much information.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will unfortunately consider that to be an autistic person being rude, when really they're trying to get through all of the possible permutations of things in their head, and to deal with all of that information. So it can be much more helpful sometimes to give them that extra space to say, okay, I'm going to introduce a topic, so you have time to think about it, and then we can come back.
Yeah, because it'll be sometimes for me anyway. It's like I'll give you like a panicked answer in the moment, and that it's not really what I've been, have not had the opportunity to work it out.
And that happens a lot in school meetings. I could definitely see that with my own children in school meetings. They feel like they're supposed to be giving an answer, and they're not necessarily ready with the answer that is the answer, but they can see people looking at them, so they feel they need to respond something. Which is why there can be a large disconnect between what a young person is saying they're experiencing at home and what they say they're experiencing to school staff.
Yeah.
And that's an important aspect of that. Another important thing to understand is tendril theory, and this is otherwise known as monotropism, which is that autistic brains are kind of single lane brains. When we are happiest, we do our best thinking and our best work, we're most effective when we're allowed to focus on the thing that we're doing, and we're not expected to be able to drop that to answer a question about something else or to switch subjects really quickly. So you can understand where in a normal school day, this is problematic because for an autistic young person, they may just finally have gotten everything switched on in their brain. They've processed everything. They're ready to go. They're getting fully into the English writing task that they've been set. And now it stops and now it's math. So the reason that it's called tendril theory, as you can see from this lovely cartoon here, is that it's like your brain is sending out all of the little information strands, and they're going out and they're getting stuck into what they're doing. And then when somebody says to you that you have to stop, it's like ripping those off. They haven't had time to retreat on their own through the normal process. They've just been ripped. And it is actually painful. So where a young person might, you think, be overreacting, like I've just asked you to go take out the garbage or whatever. The reality is that it is actually painful to have those tendrils snapped on you while you're in the middle of something that you're focused on.
And I think in an academic sense as well, if you're in school and what we find is we can get into really good flow states.
Yes.
And that for me is like, I will do my best work when I am sitting and I'm completely focused, and I could sit for hours working on something. Whereas particularly in secondary schools, you're changing subject every hour, so you're not getting the opportunity to be in a flow state and produce your best work, because the design of the system is the opposite of what you need.
So lived experience looks like this a lot in my experience personally. So the first picture there is a piece of artwork that I saw an autistic artist share on Twitter. And you'll see there that it's Medusa having her snakes cut off because her snakes are unacceptable. And that's how most of my life I have felt, is that I'm supposed to be cutting off physical living parts of myself in order to be more acceptable to the people around me. And so when I saw this picture, it was like, it was visceral. I was just like, I know what that is. Yeah. And important to note that the artist said the snakes do grow back given enough time. And I think that also is an important part of the experience, is that if we're given enough time to recover from burnout or whatever it is that we've been through, we can recover who we are. We just have to have that respected in order to allow us to do that. And my tone in my head versus how everyone perceives my tone to be. I'm a huge fan of Moana. It is my spirit Disney movie. It just sings to me, literally and figuratively. And so if you are familiar with Moana, you will know that that first picture there is Te Fiti, who is the goddess of nature. And the second one is Te Kā, which is what Te Fiti became when they stole the heart out from her. And in my head, I always sound like Te Fiti, always, like, because I'm not actively being harmful, as far as I know. But people always seem to hear me like Te Kā, because that's how they respond to me. And so that is very disorienting for me, because I'm not intending to sound like I'm a raging fire monster coming for you. And I think that's also important to understand, that especially for, and I mean, I've had lots of practice at masking. Usually I can do it pretty well. And so if there's a moment where somebody is thinking I'm sounding like Te Kā, I get really confused, because I think that I have worked out the bugs, but obviously I have missed something else. So then I have to be worried about that now. Like, and a lot of the time I have said so many times to people in my life, I can tell that I've upset you, but I don't know why. I don't know why. I can tell I have, but I don't know why. And it's important to have that understanding that an autistic young person, and I also want to note, they may not know that they're autistic, so they may not be able to wave a flag like I can and say, I'm autistic, so I might come across a little bit more blunt than you are used to. So a young person could end up sounding like Te Kā to you, but they're probably not intending that in their head, so give them the benefit of that doubt. I really wish more people would give me the benefit of that doubt, because I try very, very hard, What about you, Hannah?
Yeah, I get that a lot. I get sometimes in my family anyway, people think that I'm maybe making a comment, or I'm trying to pick a fight sometimes, and I'm not. I'm just spitting facts. But it's I'm not trying to be trying to start anything. But what I got a lot as well, which is, it's similar but not the same, is I have, like, like your resting face. people quite often look and think that there's something wrong, and it's just my face. I have to explain, like, I'm actually fine. I get that a lot, and I've been pulled up on that before in certain like work situations. Yeah.
Yep, Ronnie had said this at the beginning, was that autism is not one thing, and it is not one thing. I'm going to let Hannah, I'm going to unleash Hannah to talk about PDA here for for a little bit.
Yeah, in one slide, it's kind of impossible to cover. Okay, so I identify as PD autistic, and one of my children are PD autistic, and my mum is PD autistic. It's not well researched, although we have a lot of lived experience out there, and we can learn a lot from that. But there's lots of difficulties in having it recognized because it's not an official diagnosis. It's sometimes used in the description after you've had an assessment as maybe being like pressure sensitive or demand avoidant. But there's so much more to it. It stands for pathological demand avoidance. We don't use pathologizing language, so we prefer persistent drive for autonomy. It's really hard to describe, but for me, it's that it's a really sensitive neuroception, which is your subconscious process of scanning for danger in your environment, and it can be characterized by perceiving demands as danger. So you live a lot of your life in the threat response, so like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, etc. It can be really obvious demands, like you've got to do your homework or you have to complete this chore. It can be expectations. It can be things that you want for yourself. I know, like, sometimes for me, like, eating is really difficult because it's a demand. I have to eat, and I have to work ways around that. Sleep can also be really difficult. It really is like my entire experience, and I masked a lot growing up, especially as a teenager. So in school, I was complying to all the demands and expectations, but it made me very ill, and I was not well at home, and I self-medicated through alcohol from a really young age to cope, and it kind of became that out with the school environment, I was pretty, explosive, and I wouldn't comply to anything. And it was almost like me trying to rebalance my need for autonomy, because I had none really in a school environment. There's really good people to listen to if you want to learn more about PDA, and I would recommend Christy Forbes, Eliza Fricker, and Dr. Naomi Fisher, which I'll put that into the chat. There's lots of distinct differences if you're PD autistic as well, in that yes, routine is important, but it has to be my routine, not a routine that's been imposed by somebody else. In a school situation for my child, it was really difficult because she has an official diagnosis. They immediately implemented like visual timetables, and all of those things were actually just a list of demands on the wall that she had to do. So it was counterproductive. She just needed the autonomy to make the choices herself. Sometimes PDA can be difficult in a school environment if there's a hierarchy. Not that we don't understand hierarchy, but that it's not in line with our need to be equal and in balance with the environment. So that got me into trouble at school, because I didn't think that just because you're older than me and you're a teacher, that what you're saying is necessarily correct. And I love that about PDAs. I think a lot of autistic people have that too, is just like this need to see everybody as equal and in line together and collaboration, rather than you're above me because you're older or you're in a different class or whatever it is. PDAs also, special interests can be slightly different. I'm generalizing here. Often PDAs can have a special interest set within a person, as opposed to a topic. PDAers can seem much more sociable, and that's another reason why like being autistic isn't picked up in a lot of PDAers. It can also, you can obviously be PDA, autistic and ADHD, but sometimes ADHD is the diagnosis when actually it's PDA, because your demand avoidance can look like executive functioning issues. So for example, like not doing the thing, people might assume it's an ADHD executive functioning issue going on, rather than it's actually demand, which is why I'm not doing it. So yeah, I feel like it's a huge thing that's really hard to do in one slide, and I don't want to take up too much time. But if you do have any questions, we can get to that.
Okay. I'm going to try to share from my other computer and see if it works from there, because it's bothering me that you're not getting to see the transitions I work so hard on. And I know that sounds silly, but such is life. Oh, goody. It's working. It's a Halloween miracle.
Yay, Carrie, well done.
Okay. So yes, the one thing I want to emphasize there is that Hannah, who is just like a PDA guru for me, because there's a certain amount of that demand resistance that I feel, and I think that as you said, Hannah, it's kind of innate in autistic people that our autonomy is more important than a hierarchy, kind of all of the time. Like, if that doesn't make sense, why should I do it? They're the very specific elements of PDA that make it more challenging to provide the right supports cannot be underplayed.
No.
And if a young person or an old person, it doesn't have to be a young person, if they're struggling with feeling like there are too many demands on them, that is real paralysis. That is real paralysis. And it's important to give it the weight that it deserves. And
it's definitely something to explore and know about if you're a professional, because I can guarantee that you've come across PDAers, you know, past, present, future, and you've not been picking it up, because it comes across in such a different way to non-PDA autistic people. And that's generalizing again, because I think the emphasis here is that there's such a diversity of autistic people and such a diversity of how we express ourselves. It doesn't just look like one thing, which is what the research has focused on until recently. One
very limited view of things. So overall, what we're saying is that really the best way to support any autistic person is to take the time to ask them what they need, to listen to them when they tell you what they need, and to believe them when they tell you what they need. That is probably the biggest element of frustration in my life, has been people not believing me when I tell them, when it's been hard enough to process information out to try to explain what I'm needing, and then to not be believed is soul destroying. Okay. It's working. Okay, so all this comes down to what we just said, which is that when you're autistic, control is safety, autonomy is safety. And that when you frame it that way, when you're as a parent or as a professional thinking about, I'm having difficulty with this young person right now, getting them to understand what I need from them, or helping them to do what they need, just look at it from the perspective of they are looking for control in the situation. And that control can be positive, that control can be negative. That it's not saying that you let a young person control because this is where we can get into cutting and to self-harm, because that's control. It's control over a world that you otherwise don't have control over. It's not a positive thing, but it is providing them something. So if we want to stop that, we have to figure out what it is it's getting them and how we can work with them to find something else to do in place of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the very golden rule: autism plus environment equals outcome. Dr. Luke Bearden said this. He's a genius. And the important aspect here is that we're not going to change the autism, right? So if we have a formula here, only one part of it is a variable, and that's the environment. The environment doesn't mean just the physical things around a person. It means the people around the person, the attitudes of the people around the person, the sounds, yes, the lights, all of those things. It could just be that the blinds are a half an inch too high or too low. That could be distracting a young person in class so that they can't focus on anything. We have to really look at the environment, the whole environment around a young person, at home, at school, out in the world. What is it? What are the areas where they seem to be having challenges? Where are they at their best? And how can we replicate that? Okay, so if we want to change that outcome, the only thing that we can change is the environment. I don't know if many of you know about the assault cycle. Probably many of you do if you're professionals working in schools, but this is the normal experience of people when they're being challenged day to day. So you have a triggering event, the next event makes it worse, it escalates, it keeps going until you get to this meltdown part at the top, the meltdown shutdown. And what I want to emphasize here is that autistic people can have meltdown in two ways. It can be a meltdown or it can be a shutdown. I'm a shutdown person, which means when I go really quiet, I am not coping. I'm not okay. And I'm trying to reduce what's happening around me so that I can try to get my brain back. I will become situationally non-speaking. So if the triggering event has really been maybe something building up for a long time or just something that came out of nowhere, I will physically not be able to speak. My brain cannot make my mouth move. I'm not normally that way, you can probably tell. So it is very clear when I have gone into shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
Other people will have an external experience of that. And
yeah.
Is that you? Yeah. Okay. You talked about it, Hannah.
No, just that like when I kind of reach this peak, like I tend to have a meltdown, which isn't it's hard to talk about as an adult. You think like this shouldn't happen, but it will. Like I will be screaming, and I will be like hitting myself, and yeah, it can be pretty explosive, and then it takes me a long time to get over it, which I know you're just about to
Yeah.
get into.
And so lots of people focus on the meltdown part or the shutdown part, and they think that once that has stopped, they can now talk about what happened. But you cannot talk about what happened right now, because as you'll see from the rest of the curve here, when that crisis has finished, anything that happens immediately after that will return you to crisis because of the hormones that are in your system. So when we go into fight, flight, freeze, which is basically what the meltdown is we have reached the peak of fearing for our lives and we're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Our bodies are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. And they stay there. Those are the things that get us ready to move. And they physically shut our brain down from reasoning, because in a survival situation, we don't need to reason, we need to move. Right? So, or be very, very still. So our brains are not capable of discussing what happened, not for a very long time. We need to get all the way through this recovery process. And there will always be a post-crisis depression. There will always be this dip where you go even lower. And this is where your young person very often starts apologizing and feeling really ashamed and embarrassed of their behavior because they couldn't control it. And they know that they're supposed to be able to. I mean, Hannah, you just said it. You're supposed to be able to, right? Like, but the reality is you can't. You cannot control it. And so it isn't useful or helpful in the long term in any way whatsoever to punish or to shame, to further add shame. And I don't mean that people are doing that purposefully. Most humans are not purposefully shaming children. But it can feel like that if you're saying, next time you're going to have to do better or something like that, or any other kind of phrasing that I can't think of right now. It's very important to be thinking about the words and the actions that are taking place when a meltdown or a shutdown period has happened, for a long time, for hours after.
Yeah, like for me, so in the recovery period, that's when I'm often non-speaking, because I've like my body's exerted so much energy having a meltdown. It literally just feels like I burst open, and then like my whole body is in like pain, and I'm just so exhausted. But I know that in our house that I have one child that is more of a shutdown and another that is more meltdown. And especially like with the meltdowns, just because I'm on that sort of train of thought, when we kind of come back down, we don't talk about it for a long time. Sometimes we just don't talk about it at all. It's like it's happened, we've moved through it. It's not something that we need to go and recap over and talk through. Sometimes it's just we know why it's happened. We deal with it with kindness, and we just get back on track again when we can.
So this is a cycle that likely everybody has seen at some point, either with themselves or with a child that they've been in. And it is a very difficult thing to manage. It's emotionally hard for you as a parent to be there watching that happen. And it is even harder to not jump in and try to fix things. But in the moment, all you can do is keep the young person or the older person safe. Because they aren't in control of their actions at that moment. So let's compare, and this is very general, like I say with admitted generalizations, but it is very general because otherwise we'd be here all day. And I want to note that most of the stuff that's on the autistic morning side is my direct experience. So I've just gone with me as an example. So for a neurotypical morning, you're generally likely to have gotten a good night's sleep. You get to sleep until the alarm goes off, and then you get up, you get ready, you eat something, you grab your stuff, you leave home, you arrive at whatever event you're headed to that day, you chat with your peers, and on you go. Again, admitted generalizations. An autistic morning, my morning, is spending all night worrying and planning for what could go wrong the next day, only having a few fitful hours of sleep, weighing up the energy cost of showering versus the relative discomfort in your skin, and then eventually bathe, force self into acceptable clothing even though it hurts and feels wrong, organize things over and over until it feels okay, convince self to leave the house when the worry about being late overcomes the worry about going, script and stim all the way there to regulate and so that when you get there you can look normal, and put on sunglasses to mitigate the brightness and the busyness of an environment, and put in AirPods and play safe music to prevent impromptu conversations. So you can see that the autistic morning, aside from having, it's basically the same routine, right? The routine is the same, but it's carrying a lot more emotional and mental toll than a neurotypical morning. Does everybody know what scripting and stimming are? How about I just go with, probably you do, but let's talk about it. Hannah, you're very good at explaining scripting. You go ahead.
Well, I script a lot. So for example, this is a bad example because I don't really go to the shops, but if I had to go to the shop, I would be thinking, this is what we call our contingency planning. I'd be thinking about all the potential people that I might meet based on the time of day that I'm going to the shop. And I would be planning in my head what the conversation might be and what I'll say. And sometimes I even practice it in the mirror. like what my face looks like when I'm practicing this script. Actually, like for today, I know it's a presentation, so it's kind of different, but I had like written down everything that I felt I needed to say and like practiced it like so many times in order to try and feel comfortable with it. I still went off piste, but still, like it's like a real, that's like kind of control. That's me trying to regain control, I think, in the unpredictability of conversation with people. So that's how I would describe scripting for me.
Yeah, and it's very much the same for me. I tend to do it as I'm getting dressed, like I kind of do it like a couple steps ahead. So as I'm driving somewhere, I'm going through, okay, if this thing happens, then I will do this thing that I normally do. If this thing happens, then there's this thing. So it's like refreshing myself of the programming almost, like, you know, like calling the most likely scenarios up so that I'm ready to go with them. And it takes a lot of mental effort, and physical, it has a physical cost, a physical energy cost to do that. Stimming is, everybody stims. It's a self-regulating strategy. And so if you twirl your hair, if you tap your pencil, everybody does it. It has tended to get a negative stigma attached to it for autistic people because people associate autistic stimming with an autistic person in distress. We very rarely see an autistic person presented in culture anywhere, in TV shows, movies, books, that they aren't in distress. And so that's what we think an autistic person looks like. Somebody rocking in the corner, and making loud noises and banging their head, right? I mean, like that is so common. I actually had to stop watching a TV show from the 90s. I was going to rewatch Private Practice, and I had to stop because it got to the obligatory autism episode. And I was so enraged by the way they were representing this child and talking about this child as if they were an empty husk. And that is the standard aspect that is out there. That's what it means. So that stimming doesn't have to be obvious. I do it all the time, and almost nobody even notices. I had to point it out to the person who was assessing me during my autism assessment, because I said to him, "You probably noticed that I'm always counting my fingers." And he was like, "No, you do that really quietly." I'm like, "I know, right?" Like I have had to get good at covering that up.
Yeah.
So it's stuff that we do to keep ourselves going.
Yeah, I've got a stim where I like make little noises in my throat, and when I was a kid, it was really vocal, and not that it was my parents' fault, like they just did not have the knowledge at the time. We're talking about the 90s, right? And I like they would try and get me to do it quietly so that I guess I wouldn't draw attention to myself. So I still have this stim, but now it's a quiet stim. And I do it all like when I'm driving and stuff, like, you know, like really concentrating, like I have to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it because it I guess it helps me. It's not really a choice. I just have to do it.
Do you know what's so funny, Hannah, is yesterday I was driving with Noah and I was telling him how I was feeling really anxious about all the stuff that I had to get done today. Like I was saying to him yesterday, I have so much to get done before tomorrow, and you know, and he actually took my hand and said, "Don't bite your nails." Because he knows that because he saw, like I had started to move it to my mouth, and he was like, "You know that you do that when you're starting to feel upset and you need to calm yourself down." So it was so funny. This, my 11-year-old, right? He's sitting next to me in the car. He took my hand, and then I started to bite my lips because that's the next thing I do. You can when I can't get to my nails, as I start biting my lips. I actually have a line inside my lips.
I bite the skin on my lip too.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Carrie. So we've got one which is, does anyone get it right when they portray autistic people in TV or in movies? Anything to recommend? I personally think that it's not deliberately supposed to be an autistic character, but get lots of autistic coded characters. So like, I don't know if you watch Parks and Rec. I think like pretty much every character in Parks and Rec is
but Leslie Knope and April, definitely.
Yeah, Ron Swanson.
Yeah.
Like the
He's
yeah,
awesome.
I love
Thank you.
I love Parks and Recreation. Also, like I've not really watched it, but New Girl, Zoe
Mhm.
Deschanel's character in New
Yeah.
Girl, like there's a lot of talk on the internet about how that character is very autistic coded.
And a specifically autistic written character written by an autistic person. Exactly.
Yes,
That's
sorry,
exactly right,
Dinosaur.
Susan. That's
Yeah,
what I was just
yeah,
gonna say.
that's brilliant. Dinosaur's great. Yeah.
Dinosaur is amazing. And
Yeah.
I have a friend in America that I was sending a message to, and I was saying, do you get this there? Because you need to watch this, because not only is she unflinchingly autistic, like she is just so herself autistic. She owns that, and she is the hero. I mean,
I love it.
normally in any presentation, even if it's
Yes, love her in real life as well. Yeah.
even if it's kind of only coded, or if even if they have said they're specific, they tend to make the autistic person the butt of the joke.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's just the
It's
standard
comedy.
is
Yeah.
And in Dinosaur, she is the only one who is right all the time. Like,
Yeah,
she is so like, she is logical, and she's like, what you're doing makes no sense. And it is actually centered around her. And that show just makes me feel so happy in my
it's
heart.
excellent. It's brilliant.
It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
BBC iPlayer, Dinosaur.
Yeah. So we've got another question, which is, what is the difference between stims and tics? Well, I do both. I have a tic. And for me, I'll stim, like I'll start stimming, like, so I guess subconsciously, like I don't choose to do it. It just starts happening. But I could suppress my stimming if I needed to, but my tic, I can't.
Yeah, a tic is involuntary.
Yeah, I can't feel myself tic, but I know when I've been doing it, because the muscles here get kind of, I feel like they're being used, and then I know I've been doing it, and it's worse when I'm stressed. And like we did a conference in June, was it? And I watched some of the videos back, and I can see myself ticking all the way through it. And I was like, ugh. But I shouldn't be, like, I'm not ashamed of it or anything. It's just part of me. But as a kid, that was a hard one, because my parents, again, in the 90s, trying to, I guess, make me less of a bullying target, thought that if they kept pointing out that I was ticking, that I would somehow become conscious of it and
control
have some control over it. But, 20 odd years, 30 years later, it's not like, it's still there, ticking away.
And I think another big difference is that a tic isn't self-regulatory. It isn't self-soothing. It is a stress response, but it's not self-soothing. A stim is self-soothing, and it's you trying to regain some emotional regulation over how you're feeling, where a tic is completely involuntary. There is a huge crossover in Tourette's and autism, and I think that is just a fancy little quirk of the neurodivergent brain, is that once you've got one once one neurodivergence has been identified, it's pretty likely you've got another one in there somewhere.
Another couple.
Yeah. And actually there's a huge proportion of ADHD people who are also autistic. And they refer to themselves as AUDHD, so AUDHD. And that is again a completely different experience, because now you've got the ADHD and the autism almost kind of conflicting sometimes, but when you get into the sweet spot of meeting the needs of both of them, wow, that is some motivation there. Like you can see the power and the energy behind it. So it's about trying to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, and I think there is about a 70% crossover with autism and ADHD.
ADHD, yeah. Okay. So, we're going to try to run through the current research and the understanding now. So the difference between, like Hannah already said about the difference between pathological language and affirming language, and talk a little bit about burnout. The important thing here is I know that most people start to feel guilty about how they have talked to people in the past or how they have behaved in the past without having this perspective. And as an autistic person, I can say I don't hold it against anybody that they didn't know something, right? But once you know better, as Maya Angelou says, once you know better, then we do better. And so it's about taking the current understanding and methodology and moving forward with it rather than looking back at where it all went wrong before. So the social lived experience versus the medical deficit-based model. So Hannah, you already talked about this a little bit with the pathologizing language, but the medical deficit-based model is the one that everybody will be familiar with. That's the one that says that autism is a disorder. It's the reason that it was in the mental health disorders, like listed as a mental health disorder for a really long time. It continues to be referred to as a communication or a social disorder. And that it is about how many degrees away from normal you are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we come into functioning labels, talking about high functioning, low functioning, stuff like that. Functioning labels don't do anything that they are not accurately reflecting the autistic person's experience. They're only reflecting the experience of the people around the autistic person.
Mm-hmm.
So if they aren't a whole lot of trouble, they are referred to as high functioning.
High functioning to you.
High functioning to you. If they seem to need an awful lot of attention, then they're low functioning. That is not reflective of the experience of the individual. And all functioning labels do is act as gatekeepers to support.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are high functioning, people say, well, they can't really need that much support because they're high functioning. So they don't get this and they don't get that and they don't get that. And the other way, it's about stripping people of autonomy. For low functioning people, they don't have really the understanding. So it's infantilizing to those people to say that they can't possibly understand what's going on around them. They can't make decisions for themselves. There's a very big difference between being autistic and having capacity.
Mm-hmm. And also sometimes the high functioning label can be used as almost like sympathy and but like it's not so bad, you know, like being as if being autistic is a tragedy, but you're high functioning, so it's not so bad. It's not so bad. It's okay. Like I've had that.
Or say,
yeah.
If you are autistic, you must be high functioning.
Yeah.
Right. As if that's a compliment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's what I say. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reality is that medical model language is observer centric. It's about their experience of an autistic person, not an autistic person's experience of their life,
Mm-hmm.
not their internal experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I, lucky me, got a diagnosis of Asperger's because I'm so high functioning.
Yeah, there's that Aspie supremacy kind of thing, isn't there? Yeah.
However, I already told you that I can't take a shower every day because of the sensory overwhelm of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a fairly basic thing for a lot of people to do. Get up, get in the shower. I have to sit and consider that. It can take me hours. And so my experience of being an autistic person is not limited to what other people can see.
Mm-hmm. Carrie, could you maybe just describe, because I remember you doing this when we've given this presentation before and I thought it was really good, the difference between Asperger's and ASD diagnosis?
Yes. So this is, again, I asked the person who was assessing me when I was having my autism assessment, I said, what is the difference? Like, why do you get one or the other? And he said, well, it all comes down to when you developed language. So if you had language at the normal milestone time, then that's Asperger's or even early. So like my oldest son, he was hyperlexic and hyperverbal. He taught himself to read by the time he was 2.5. And so he was like way ahead of the curve. So he was Asperger's. My younger son didn't speak till he was 4. So he got a diagnosis of autism. Classic autism. That's actually what the diagnosis was put down as. So, that's something to think about. Again, that's about the observer's experience of that person, not that person's experience of their life or themselves.
And the history behind
and the history behind
which
it.
is a whole other conversation. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, because we could get into why Asperger's in general is not a title anyone should be using. Like, there's lots of problems there with that. But it also does come down again to this functioning label thing of really who's useful and who isn't.
Who's useful in
who
a
causes trouble?
Society. Yeah.
Who causes trouble? Who doesn't? So which are the ones that we're okay with being around, and which are the ones that not so good? And so it sets up a hierarchy, actually, within autistic people themselves that is neither necessary nor helpful. Okay, so affirming language. Neurodiversity is not the same thing as neurodivergence. Neurodiversity is all of the flavors of cupcakes, including vanilla, and vanilla is neurotypical. Okay, so all of the cupcakes are diverse because they're all different flavors. Neurodivergence is anything that's not vanilla. So it's what's separate from the neurotypical or the predominant neurotype, as some people refer to it, because it is considered to be the predominant neurotype. Most people are neurotypical. We live in a world that is designed by and for the needs of neurotypical people. And that is why neurodivergent people struggle so much, because our needs have not been wrapped in to the way things have been designed and implemented. And we just don't line up with that. It doesn't mean that our needs are wrong or that we need to change, right? We need to change the environment, not the person. Also, identity first versus person first language. We've already touched on this in terms of pathology, but I'd like to talk about the origin of person first language, which is, it was rooted in the disabled community looking for recognition of the fact that they are in fact people. And that's just really sad, if you ask me, that there had to be a movement in the 80s for disabled people to get non-disabled people to recognize them as human. I am of the opinion that I should not have to remind somebody that I'm a human. They should be able to look at me, and whether or not I have an autism flag flying over my head, be able to say that there is a person. The way that the language has been taken and used is that people say, well, we need to use person first language because we want to separate that person from their disability because they're more than their disability. This is ableism. There is nothing wrong with being disabled. I don't need to be separated from being disabled. It's an adjective. It describes me. I am autistic. I am disabled. And those aren't things I need to be ashamed about. I don't need to be separated from it. And it is harmful to me for you to try to separate out the things that change me and my life and my experience of the world. It does not help me. It might help you feel better as a neurotypical person, but I don't need to be separated because I don't feel like I'm degrees away from normal. I'm fairly normal. I'm just not neurotypical. So there's a big difference. The big difference between identity and person first language is that identity first is about an adjective. It's a part of me. And person first is a noun. It's a characteristic versus a disease state. So when we talk about people having things, so people will say, well, they have autism, right? We have cancer. There's a reason we say it that way. It's because it's a bad thing. I don't, and I'm not more than, like, nobody would say that their cancer defines them, right? It's a bad thing. But I am autistic, and it does define me, and it does define my experience of the world, and it certainly defines the way that people treat me, whether or not they know I'm autistic. It certainly impacts the way people view me as Taka when I'm actually being Tafiti. So it's important to understand, like, oh, and I normally say, we wouldn't say that somebody has Judaism, right? Or somebody has Buddhism. They are Buddhist. They are Jewish. I am autistic. We already talked a little bit about PDA, but I don't know if you said persistent demand for autonomy. Did you?
Yeah, so I would normally say persistent drive for autonomy.
Oh,
but it doesn't.
sorry.
It's that's okay. The demand part isn't the problem. It's the pathological part that's the problem. There's a couple of different variations that people use in place of pathological demand avoidance. But yeah, just anything that avoids medical pathologizing language. Any other alternative is cool.
Yeah, because the pathologizing is about saying this is normal over here, and this is how far away from it that you are.
Yeah, and the disorder narrative that, there's something there is this ordered template that we're not able to apply to, when really that's not life. That's not representative of the true diversity of people.
Yeah. Okay. And on to masking. So masking burnout and mental health. Masking is the projection of an entirely different self. This is Medusa getting her snakes cut off. She is covering up who she is, and not just changing context. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. She's actually trying to be somebody else that she thinks is acceptable, either because she has been made to through ABA training, or because she has realized that nobody likes her as her, and she's trying to find somebody that somebody will like. And it is, I don't even have the words for how draining this is physically and mentally. I literally cannot explain it, except for to say that it sucks you up whole, trying to do this over and over and over and over every day, your entire life. And that is how we get into burnout. So burnout is very often mistaken as depression, and they can look very much alike. But the difference is that antidepressants aren't going to fix your burnout. If you are in burnout long enough, it can become clinical depression, because the chemicals in your brain will drop the way that they would with depression. But the reality is that burnout is that you have pushed yourself well beyond what your body can handle for pretending to be somebody else, and like the energy and the focus that takes, and you've lost who you are in that. Like there's just this, you become blank, and you need to shut down, remove yourself as much as possible from the world, and rebuild yourself. And obviously these things, masking and burnout, can lead to mental health difficulties.
I've just popped in the chat a book by Kieran Rose and Dr. Amy Pearson, which I never have far away from me. This is incredible. This really is essential reading, I would say, for anyone that cares for or works with autistic people.
Yep. We were very lucky to have Dr. Amy Pearson at our conference in June, and she was just phenomenal. She was phenomenal. The way that she broke down stigma, like it was, it was brilliant. There's a video, if people are interested, we can share that. So I added this slide because I saw this graphic just earlier this week, and I thought it's just so beautiful. It does it so much better than what I can do to explain it. And autistic masking is not context switching. Everybody context switches. You are a different person at home than you are at work. You're a different person with your friends than you are with your parents. That's context switching. Autistic masking, like the center of yourself is the same. You're just changing your language a little bit to meet the situation. You're meeting the parameters of that situation, right? You don't swear at work, or maybe you do. But like, do you know what I mean? Like there are certain expectations in those environments. Autistic masking is being somebody else entirely, because you have learned from as early as nursery school, and I can state that as a fact because of the young people that I work with and that I know personally.
Mm-hmm.
From as early as nursery school,
And
learning
there is,
that who
there is
you are,
research backing up that up now too. Yeah.
that who you are is not acceptable, and you have to find somebody else to be. So this graphic here is saying that it's about suppressing your stims, your more obvious stims, just like Hannah was telling us she's done. Having that social script, forcing eye contact even though it hurts, suppressing your autistic joy. And that is one that has absolutely destroyed like my inner self. I all the time got made fun of for being excited about things that people thought were stupid. And so now I try not to show, and I don't ask questions. I used to ask so many questions.
Mm-hmm.
I used to ask so many questions because I wanted to understand everything, and people got really annoyed with me. And so I don't do that. And I keep them inside. I like choke on them, the questions still. Copying other people's behavior in social situations to try to like mimic what other people are doing to try to fit in. Hiding that you're in pain from any number of sensory overwhelms. Specifically, not talking about the things that you love, because you have learned that people think you're weird when you do that. So again, it's denying parts of yourself and creating somebody else, consciously altering facial expressions, tone of voice, stuff. So do you see, it's about being somebody else entirely. And then when you do that long enough, you sometimes can't remember who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So ableism in the system, I talked a little bit about this already, but this is what leads to anxiety, masking, burnout, low self-esteem, and poor mental health. So there are expectations. Everybody has to be well behaved. And what that means is behaved neurotypically. You can't ask too many questions because that's rude. You can't speak directly because that's rude. There's no real definition of where that line is, but for some reason, the neurotypical people know when it's rude. You have to always be approachable and flexible and instantly responsive, which, as we've already talked about with the tendril theory, is just not suited to an autistic brain. There are public rewards and punishments for observed behavior and compliance. Compliance matters more than anything else in most neurotypical social settings. There's an inflexibility with where, when, and how you can exist. So you're constantly having to check yourself. And most support is behavior-based, not needs-based. Very few people are stopping and asking the autistic person, what do you need? And then listening to them and believing them. Instead, they're saying, I need you to change this behavior, because it's about their experience of the autistic person, not the autistic's experience of life.
Mm-hmm.
Want to add anything?
Just a good example I have about the behavior-based support versus need-based support. So there was an example when one of my children was in primary 2, and the teacher came out to me at the end of the day and said that they wouldn't tidy up their mess, and that they got to do that in the real world. You know, they weren't going to get away with it because they need to do that in the real world. And basically what happened is that in the school where my child was for primary 1, the class cleaned together. There was no individual assigned, you've got to clean your thing, you've got to clean your thing. It was everybody tidies up everything together. So that meant that they were all on the same level.
Mhm.
And in this other school, it was, no, you tidy up this, that's your mess, you tidy up that. And I guess perhaps that they had more mess than maybe somebody beside them. So suddenly it felt out of balance. And that was just perceived as, you're being difficult, you just don't want to tidy up, but you've got to do this in the real world. So it was looking at the behavior and the demand avoidance rather than the need. And the need was, it didn't feel equal and fair, and in the way that being asked to do this was being delivered. So I think that's quite a good example of
it is.
Always.
And it's too about like kind of the expectation based on previous experience.
Absolutely.
And if maybe they had taken the time to explain why it was different, rather than it feeling like even like a punishment of, well, you made more mess, so you have to clean up more mess. You know, like it's all about the way it's
can't,
explained.
not won't as well.
Yes.
So
yes.
it was like that triggered the threat response. So then they were in a state of fight or flight, and you can't access your upstairs brain and your logic and things when you're suddenly in this stress response. But it's like, why aren't you doing this? You've got to do this in the real world, which is ableist in itself, because we're in the real world living with disabilities, and there's nothing about school that is reflective of the real world.
And also, you know, I say this a lot, but we make the world. So you know, we can change what the real world is. So some other ways that public spaces are disabling. There are countless uncontrollable environment variables, which we've already kind of talked about. The unwritten codes of conduct, the unexplained expectations. You can read all those. I don't need to read them for you. The idea really is that there is a lot more going on in a public space than you probably realize for autistic people. And at the end of the day, appropriate behavior is always considered to be neurotypical behavior. Whether or not people are conscious of that's what they're expecting is neurotypical behavior, that is what they're expecting. And it takes being very deliberate and actively choosing to recognize that a child or an adult is not doing something because they're being defiant. They're telling you what they need. Okay, so being autistic in a neurotypical world is like being origami. I saw that somebody said that on Twitter. We fold ourselves into shapes to please others who never see how much effort has gone into the folding or how much lasting damage is done to achieve it. And I said at the session that I did earlier this month with Allison, I was talking about how I was making dinner one night and trying to reuse a piece of tinfoil because I'm very concerned about the limited supply of tin in the world. And okay, so maybe that makes me autistic. But I am really concerned about the limited supply of tin. And so I try to be really thoughtful about how much tinfoil I'm using and being able and reusing. But I realized as I was doing it that you can only unfold it so many times. And obviously once you've bent it at all, it's bent. You're not unbending it. It's never going to be flat again. And you can only reshape it so many times until it tears. And as I was doing it, I thought, oh my God, that is just the perfect metaphor for masking. You can only do that so many times until you tear. And it just felt really strong and true, you know, that this is what we're doing. And so many people don't see that. They don't. And why should they? Nobody's mentioned it to them before, right? Like the world isn't set up for that, which is.
I think it's really important to add that masking is a response to being unsafe in an environment. It's not a good thing.
No.
And masking is really closely linked to the poor outcomes that a lot of autistic people experience, like sexual abuse, suicidal ideation. I think we've got some pretty stark statistics. Is it that autistic children are 28 times more likely to think about suicide than their neurotypical peers? And a lot of that is linked to masking, which is caused by stigma and being unsafe. Yeah. So it's not, masking is not something to ever be taken lightly. It couldn't be more serious.
And we shouldn't ever encourage a child to do it.
No.
The number one cause of death in autistic adults who do not have learning disabilities is suicide. There's a reason for that. And the real world plays a part in that. How we support people, how we approach people, how we accept them for who they are. Yeah, that plays a part in that. So coping is not the same thing as thriving. Again, here's NeuroWild because I love her. Coping is not the same as thriving. And lots of times we'll say, well, they seem to be coping okay, or how did they get on at school? Well, they coped okay. Neurodivergent kids and neurodivergent adults, okay, should not have to settle for coping. Mm-hmm. We all deserve to thrive. And if nothing else comes from today, then please be thinking about how the environment that you're in, or that you're creating, or that you're participating in is working towards helping somebody thrive rather than cope. So how do we change that? We change it with autism affirming mindsets. We stop pathologizing. We start normalizing. We recognize that it's not won't, which is judgmental and insulting, frankly, and that it's can't. I particularly feel strongly about the NeuroWild image in the corner of the person at the edge, which is a lot of the time we talk about, well, that young person needs to develop the skills to do this. They need to be challenged. Not when they're on the edge of the cliff, they don't. We need to move them further back away from that edge before we start trying to throw additional pressures on them. When young people are able to do well, they do well. If they're not doing well, there's a reason. Ross Greene said that, didn't he? Hannah?
Yes.
Yeah. When they can do well, they do well. Mm-hmm. So, and also diversity. People talk a lot about diversity. We have that whether or not we try to, because we're all different. Mm-hmm. We should be seeking equity, so everybody can make a situation equitable. Inclusion is not inherently equitable. Mm-hmm. We need to support that systematically in order to allow it to be equitable. And belonging is going to happen for an autistic person only when they aren't being made to feel that things have been lessened in order for them to participate, or, that there isn't even a question of them participating. Of course, the environment is right for them. They're just coming along with everybody else. Mm-hmm. So in thinking of all of this, I want you to think about how this is homework for everybody. How will this change how you interact with your young people, with your communities, how you support your colleagues, and how you support yourself? Because it's important to think about how this applies to you. We usually say somewhere at the beginning, but we didn't this time, that neurodivergence is genetic. So it's inherited. So a lot of the people that we talk to, whether or not they have a diagnosis of anything, if their child is neurodivergent, it's come from somewhere. So if any of this resonates with you, then if any of this resonates with how this is your experience, then please think about what that could mean about you and your life.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's, in fact, the most common thing for autistic women to only be identified after their children have been identified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And on the note of autistic women, especially like the cisgender women, where there's this idea that there's a different kind of autism if you were, you know, assigned female at birth. That's complete nonsense. It's just a different type of prejudice, and a narrative that came from researchers looking at the gap between diagnosis for men and women, and obviously it was a lot higher in boys and men. And at the same time, there was emerging research about masking, and they just conflated the two, that women are better at masking, so that's why we can't find them. And it's just not true. It ignores the diversity of the autistic experience. It really invalidates experiences of non-binary and trans people too. And it's something that's caught on that is, it's a myth. It's not true.
It's not true, because my 15-year-old son could not be more me if he tried.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that the things that they use as in the diagnostic criteria, which are inherently flawed and deeply biased, the original diagnostic criteria, which they still use, it sets up a dynamic where if girls order things up, well, that's good housekeeping. That's the societal expectation of our gender, is that girls keep house, they keep things tidy, they're very, compliant, and so on. So if you're doing those things, then you can't be autistic. You're just a good girl.
Mm-hmm.
If a boy is lining things up, if he's lining up his trucks, well, that's not the way you play with trucks, so that's disordered.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how society has chosen to value one over the other. Thank you for mentioning that. We normally talk about that earlier on.
Yeah, I have to get it in though, because it's my biggest pet peeve
Yeah.
is when people start talking about like the female autism phenotype. I'm like, ugh. Yeah.
So we want to remember, above all else, autism plus environment equals outcome. And we can only change the environment. Thank you. Oh, I have extra slides that I can just show that I was super excited about. I couldn't find a place for them. So.
Flow state, yeah.
Yeah, flow state.
Leave me alone.
Leave me alone. I'm in flow state.
So true.
Sign to hold up. Diagnosis is not a label. It's a key to the door of understanding and to community. I would add to community. And ABA trains autistic children to mask on purpose. So that's why ABA is bad. And I saw these, look at that map of monotropic experiences. Isn't that fabulous?
Mm-hmm.
Stimpunked in that. And also Peter Warmby said, if you want to teach autistic children social skills, be explicit that they're neurotypical social skills.
Yeah.
They're useful when dealing with non-autistic folks, but not the only correct way. So somebody at the beginning said challenges, difficulty with communication. And the thing is, autistic people have no difficulty communicating with each other.
Yes. Oh my gosh, no problem at all.
We're good with that.
We've got a question. Can I please ask what ABA means? It's applied behavior analysis. And it's abusive. There's just no question about it. I think it was like negative reinforcement quite often, isn't it, Carrie? Well,
they've changed it now. They've rebranded to PBS, which is positive behavioral supports. But it's basically the same thing, which is they figure out. So this is how Alfie Cohn explained it at our conference in June. They find the thing that your child loves the most and then hold it ransom.
Mm-hmm.
And until you can perform the way that they want you to, that they have decided is the appropriate way, which we have already learned is the neurotypical way, that's the appropriate way. Until they can do that, so that means covering up your stims, changing your tone of voice, making your face not look like your face, until you can do those things, you don't get the thing back that you love.
And make no mistakes that there are examples of PBS that are used in schools still and all the time. Like this, this is happening.
That's what behavior charts are. That's
Exactly.
behavior charts
Yeah.
are PBS.
Mm-hmm.
Public shaming to get you to comply. Yeah. So autistic social skills should be valued. And then Kelly Mahler she's sent out this in her free resources that she has, compliance-based versus interoception-based. So interoception is one of our senses. And this is a great resource. Go to her website for it. Okay. So I'll finish now.